Jan might have said in the Brady Bunch with about Marcia, it's China, China, China. And, the more things change, the more they stay the same with China. Our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, was in China, in Beijing, trying to, according to the press, was trying to do something very simple. He was trying to reset relations with China. Heard that before. So he traveled to China amid low expectations and global worries of a new Cold War. Hey, folks, guess what? NPR, government-funded radio propaganda arm of the United States government. Please understand a simple thing. China's been at war with us since at least 2005. They've written the doctrine out of how they're going to do it. They're following the doctrine that got leaked like 5 years ago. Everybody knows China's at war with the United States. China seeking hegemony over the world and want to push the United States into a second-class power. That has been true for years and years, and in fact, more than a decade. And yet our good friends at NPR want to pretend like we're not in a new Cold War. We've been in a Cold War. We just haven't known it. It's been a one-sided Cold War while China runs the table on us, while naive American politicians like Anthony Blinken and Joe Biden sit there and pretend like they're operating in the year 2000 rather than operating in the year 2023. So here's what we have. We have Blinken goes to China. This story is by Emily Fang, who is from Xinjiang. She actually is a correspondent with NPR, but she does a lot of traveling around China. Is a reporter who's allowed to travel around China, and so she has some interesting access to different information, and she provides different information. And I want to just show you the first piece of this information that we have here, and that is, well, first of all, I want to say Anthony Blinken gives the idea of what we're actually looking to one of the things we're trying to do. We want to curb fentanyl at high stakes visits. So he wants to curb fentanyl. If that sounds familiar, you probably would be interested to remember that back when Donald Trump was president, the Trump administration won a major policy shift from Chinese on fentanyl. And that was a major focus of the Trump administration to try to have China declare fentanyl a dangerous drug and limit its export. Guess what? The Chinese signed a trade agreement with the Trump administration, including this curbing fentanyl sales and trying to stop fentanyl leaving China. And what they did as soon as Joe Biden came into office is they kicked it into high gear. They're using the cartels to ship it over our borders, and they're killing Americans at least by the tens of thousands, if not more, with fentanyl poisoning. So the Chinese are engaged in a war. The war is very reminiscent of what the Brits did to the Chinese during way back when in the opioid wars, where the Brits went off and they took opioid and they pushed it they really dealt it all over China, particularly in the Cantonese region, and they effectively drugged out the Chinese population, the young population in China, and they met passive resistance halfway around the globe and managed to control a large part of Chinese territory for a long time based on that winning the opioid war back in the 1800s. So this is not a new strategy. China remembers their history. America doesn't remember any history. And the Chinese are engaged as part of their strategy is an opioid war on America. They're using fentanyl as the opioid. And the attempt is to wipe out significant portions of the American population, particularly young men who are fighting age. Guess what? If you were the Chinese, wouldn't you rather have to kill 100,000 people a year who might be picking up arms against you without having to fire a shot? I think it's pretty clear what the strategy is. Trump administration fought to create a subsiding of the export of fentanyl. Biden came in, it got escalated. Our deaths went up 50% in terms of opioid-related deaths in America. And that situation remains. In fact, because of the open border, it's dramatically worse. So the Biden administration is directly responsible for the flooding of fentanyl into our country. And they want to go to China hat in hand. Please help us with this problem. Well, all they had to do is, hey, we kind of expect you to live up to your agreement that you made back with the Trump administration. But since we know the Biden administration does not recognize that the Trump administration exists, they couldn't do that. And we didn't want to remind anybody that this is a problem that the door was shut to some extent. And then when they came in, they reopened the door. And now they want to renegotiate already won territory with the Chinese government that quite honestly doesn't care what the Biden administration thinks. But let's just go back to this, another piece of the puzzle here. So how do you think the Chinese reacted to this meeting? I need to reemphasize kind of what happened with this meeting, because it was somewhat disingenuous how the Chinese did it. You'll remember that when Anthony Blinken, when the Biden administration first came into office in 2021, met with his Chinese counterpart in Anchorage, Alaska, in an attempt to establish relations and reset relations, because the Trump administration was so bad with China. And what ended up happening was, in what was supposed to be a 1-minute introductory speech at a press conference, Anthony Blinken got up and made his 1-minute statement of conciliation. We want to be friends, and can't we all just get along? And the Chinese, his Chinese counterpart, got up and delivered a 22-minute diatribe attacking the United States on every front, basically telling the world and telling Blinken, you don't have legitimacy as a government. And repeating all the lies from Black Lives Matter, all the lies and attacks that the Biden campaign itself levied against the United States of America, repeated those back to Blinken and attacked our country. And Blinken stood there and took it. He didn't fight back. He didn't defend our country at all. He didn't do anything, showing the Chinese once and for all that how weak the Biden administration was going to be, that they would not even defend our own country on our own ground, Anchorage, Alaska, in front of our own media, and would let the Chinese bully us. That's what Blinken did in their first meeting. So guess what? When he shows up in Beijing, what happens? Well, the Chinese say, well, he's a low-level figure. He's just a Secretary of State. He's a low-level figure. So we're going to meet him at the airport with a low-level bureaucrat who greets him. No big fanfares. No, this isn't Henry Kissinger going around doing shuttle diplomacy back from the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. No, this is Anthony Blinken coming in and being treated like he's the Secretary of State of Ghana. And and that may be a slight to the Secretary of State of Ghana. I apologize to the Ghanese people, but that's how he's treated. And so he shuffles around through Beijing, and about an hour before he's scheduled to leave, President Xi of China says, oh, well, let's have a quick I've got 45 minutes on my schedule, right now. So let's come together and let's meet. So that's what happens. So what's the outcropping of this? Well, first of all, let's just see what we know about this. It was, let me find the Fox News one. Well, what we know is that our good friend Anthony Blinken gave the following news to Xi. Blinken says U.S. does not support Taiwan independence during China visit. That's what he told Xi at a time when China's been running massive military preparation to invade China, at a time when standing up and saying to Xi, the United States will not tolerate China's further aggression against Taiwan, might have been a message you might want to send to China. But no, what Blinken did is say, well, we don't support Taiwanese independence. Now, some would argue that is actually somewhat of a restatement of our policy, because we've typically been very ambiguous about what would happen in terms of Taiwanese independence. That's been the case since Richard Nixon went to China in 1971, I guess it was. And since that time, Taiwan gets booted out of the Olympic Games. China gets, the communist government of China gets put in. We see Taiwan more isolated in the world. But let's be clear, we've been selling U.S. arms to Taiwan for an awful long time, and it isn't because we support the Chinese government, the communist Chinese taking over Taiwan. That's not why we've been sending them arms. We've been sending them arms and have been show strength by having the 7th Fleet occupy places through the Taiwan Straits and elsewhere around China to send a direct message to China that we will defend Taiwan. That's the message we've been sending to China on the military side. And then our Secretary of State goes, and he doesn't provide any ambiguity. No, he says, we don't support Taiwan independence, directly to President Xi while he's sitting there contemplating invading Taiwan. That is the biggest signal of weakness that you could possibly have, and indicates and gives Xi perhaps a false impression, perhaps a real impression. I'm not sure, but certainly will leave him with the impression that the United States has no intention of doing anything to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. Not exactly a great way to try to stop a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Blinken could have said, Taiwan is very important to the United States, and we really support all the trade we're doing with China and really rebuilding our relationship and growing our relationship. But Taiwan is a place where I think that you need to take a step back, and or you put all the positives of the relationship at risk. Remember, China right now has about a $400 billion trade surplus in the United States. That means they get $400 billion of our money in trade going to them, while they send us plastic trinkets to buy at their stores. That's what that trade difference is. That's $400 billion of positive cash flow to China at a time where many business analysts are saying, guess what? China has a slowing economy. China's in trouble. Now, I don't know that China's in trouble. What I do know is that there's some business analysts are saying that. A couple of stories have been written concurrent with Blinken's visit to China, which I think are designed to try to create a false an impression that the Chinese are weaker than perhaps they are. But the Chinese economy has never been very transparent. In fact, it's opaque. The only way we know about how the Chinese economy is actually growing is by measuring things like how much energy they're using and translating that energy into other things. We do know that they haven't come back from COVID, that the rebound from COVID is not as strong as some people thought it would be, and that's bad news for the Xi regime. They also, some of the analysts, sit there and look, and they say rather than having more of a capitalist free enterprise burst in China, that the economy is becoming much more command and control oriented, and in doing so, those command and control oriented economies typically fail. Of course, we can look here in America, where the Biden administration is trying to emulate the Chinese economy in its worst possible components. But nonetheless, that's what some of those analysts are saying, and they could be right, they could be wrong. What we do know is that Blinken went in and he blinked. He went in and he blinked. And so let's just see what the Chinese have to say about this thing, because I go back to Emily Feng, because she happened to publish on her Twitter page the Chinese version of their statement. You see, that's Chinese. I can't read that, so I got it translated in English so we can all get along here. And here's what they read out is from the meeting of the Chinese Secretary of State and Anthony Blinken. I'm just going to read this and a part of it, and you can take it for what it's worth. Let's start. Wang Yi said that Mr. Secretary of State's visit to China comes at a time of critical juncture. I got to scroll this back a little bit, make it so I can read it. At a critical juncture and Sino-U.S. relations, and it is necessary to make a choice between dialogue or confrontation, cooperation or conflict. History always moves forward, and China-U.S. relations will eventually move forward. There's no way out to turn back the wheel of history, and it is even less advisable to start over. Okay, let me just be clear. When a communist talks about the wheel of history, they're talking about the Marxist dialectic. The Marxist dialectic says that the movement towards communism is inevitable. It is not possible to stop. So when they're talking about history, anybody says something like, you're on the wrong side of history. Well, what they're saying is that communism wins and you don't want to be on the wrong side of communism. Well, guess what? If you don't stand up to communism, if you don't stand up to this so-called wheel of history, you cannot win. You cannot win. The Chinese definition of the wheel of history is that China becomes preeminent, the U.S. goes by the wayside. That's their definition. So when you see the Chinese talk this way, you understand they are essentially saying The U.S. must surrender to China to not be in the way of the world, so the world can move forward. With an attitude, and with it is even less advisable to start over. Why would it be? Why do they think it's less advisable to start over? Because they're winning now. Okay, they don't want to start over because they're winning now. The only way you stop the Chinese growth is you change the game. You basically take the board and you throw it up in the air and say, we're not playing the game that way anymore. You attack. You go to the corporations. You say you either move your stuff out of China, or you're not importing in the United States. Tom Cotton's got legislation. Senator Tom Cotton's got legislation that would end the permanent normalized trade relations status that we gave to China in 2000 that set this whole path forward in terms of China playing both sides, pretending to be capitalists on one side, attracting in the multinationals, and then on the other side going off and saying, well, we're not going to play, we're going to continue to be communists, and we're going to use that money for right now that we're getting to build up a military and to be able to challenge America around the world. That's what they did. That's what happened. And oh, by the way, they just hollowed out America with them exporting aluminum plants, whole aluminum plants back out to China, with them copying factories that were built in China, copying them and driving the U.S. company virtually out of business based on the fact that they were using U.S. patents, U.S. design, and then producing products because of slave wages at a fraction of what our companies could produce them at, even in China, and driving those companies out of business. Just see, if you want an example, just see the fiber optic business and how they controlled the fiber optic business based on copying the actual how people like Corning were making fiber optics, and this happened in the early 2000s. Anyway, let's continue. With an attitude of being responsible to the people, history, and the world, we must reverse the downward spiral of Sino-U.S. relations, push for return to a healthy and stable track, and work together to find a correct way for China and the United States to get along in the new era. In the new era. What is a new era? The new era is one where China is dominant. That's their idea of the new era. This isn't a bilateral, we're all going to just get along. No, the new era is Chinese dominant, U.S. submissive. That's the new era. So we need to find a correct way for China and the United States to get along in the new era. When you emphasize that the trough in Sino-U.S. relations is rooted in the U.S.'s erroneous perception of China, which leads to wrong policies towards China. So the Chinese are just misunderstood. Please understand the fact they are exporting enough fentanyl into our country to kill every man, woman, and child. Just misunderstood. The fact that they are engaged in trying to usurp the U.S. all over the world and upend U.S. long-term allies all over the world, just a misunderstanding. I'll give you a simple example. Solomon Islands. Anybody who's familiar with World War II is familiar with Solomon Islands. We liberated them from the Japanese, and the Solomon Islands became kind of a place where America was able to. We had ports there, and it was a normal kind of port of entry. Solomon Islands matter because they're close to Australia, and it was part of the island hopping that we did throughout the South Pacific. Year ago, I guess about a year ago now, U.S. ships went to port of call in the Solomon Islands, and the leadership of the Solomon Islands told them, "Don't stop here. You're not welcome." They'd done a deal with the Chinese. The Chinese effectively turned the Solomon Islands into a vassal state. And the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy, the Navy that liberated the Solomon Islands, was not welcome. So we got to do for China. And so let's go back. For China-U.S. relations to be stable long-term, the most important thing is follow the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation proposed by President Xi Jinping. That sounds good. Guess what? Peaceful coexistence means China's preeminent, we're submissive. You got to understand that's always at the heart of this. Wang Yi explained in depth the historical logic and inevitable trend of China's development and rejuvenation. Okay, historical logic and inevitable trend. You can't stop us. That's what the historical imperative says. Historical logic, historical imperative. It's all rooted in Marxism. introduce the distinctive features of Chinese-style modernization, the rich connotations of people's democracy throughout the process. People's democracy in China. It's a democracy where nobody votes. It's a democracy where the people who are disfavored end up being dismembered and their body parts being sold to other wealthy people around the world, where they use slave labor as a standard feature, where they suppress religion, where they sit there and they create a social credit score system that allows for the Chinese government to eliminate all dissent by virtue of denying people who are dissenters or even suspected of being dissenters of having simple things like the ability to make money. Get fed, certainly take a vacation. All those things are under social credit scores. You have to kowtow to the Chinese government, to the communist Chinese government, in order to be able to have even any basic stuff. You want to eat more than rice? You darn well better not get on the wrong side of the social credit score system. And that's a credit score system that the Biden administration is attempting to implement here in America. Yay, team, way to go. So this is how, so guess what? That's what when they talk about democracy is essentially suppressing anybody who doesn't support the government. I'm sure you can understand why the Biden administration likes the Chinese so much, since that's what they're trying to do. Wang asked the U.S. side to stop hyping up the China threat theory, lift illegal unilateral sanctions against China, stop suppressing Chinese technological development, and refrain from wantonly interfering in China's internal affairs. Okay, wantonly interfering in China's internal affairs means we don't really think you ought to be imprisoning people for being Christians. We don't really think that you ought to be imprisoning people for being Muslims. Speaking of the problem with the I think it's Zhangzhou. So we're looking at, that's China's internal affairs. If we want to enslave populations that we don't like, you shouldn't mention that. That's none of your business. If the multinationals who are ostensibly Western, at least, or maybe even US-based companies, are making things using slave labor, you shouldn't have anything to say about that. Just shut up and buy our crap. That's what they're saying. Well, no, we're not going to do that. Technological development, heck, one of the single most important things that Donald Trump did is he stopped Huawei from being able to integrate its systems into all of our communication systems. Joe Biden stopped that. He said, oh, no, Huawei, no problem. Well, guess what? What the Chinese have been trying to do is put their components into every single key electronics system in the world with the back doors, allowing them to turn them off. Imagine if you had planes in the air all over your country, all over the world, and the Chinese could say, well, we're going to take Taiwan, and if you try to do anything about it, we're going to take down every aircraft in the world in this sector of the world over the United States. We're going to send a message. We're going to basically send a kill message to the software, through the hardware into the software that effectively makes it so the plane won't fly anymore. Imagine the fun that would be. What do you think is going to happen? The Chinese will use the technological advantages that they have to try to destroy, as a cudgel, essentially as a blackmail tool, to force submission. That's what they will do. Donald Trump said no. Joe Biden, not so much. You can tell it bothers them because that's part of their growth plan. Being dominant in technology is the future. That's what they're trying to do. This is what they're worried about. So we're busy going over there and say, hey, we got a fentanyl problem, and we're not going to close our borders. We're going to let some Chinese companies control some of our ports of entry into the country. But we really need your help. Quit sending fentanyl here. And what's the Chinese response? Stop blocking our attempt to have technological superiority and infiltrate every single bit of software and hardware in the world with our technology, so we can effectively control and be dominant in the next century. That's what they say. So guess what? The answer on the fentanyl that they should have given Joe Biden is close your borders. You don't want fentanyl. How about you not allow people to come across the borders? How about you don't stop promoting the usage of illegal drugs and instead start promoting people getting off of illegal drugs? As opposed to making it okay to be high, why don't we try to make it say, no, it's not okay, and we're going to give you help. And let's try to fight a different war on drugs, a war on drugs that meets the needs of the people who've been afflicted by it and discourages new people from being killed by it. Kind of a unique concept, I guess, but that's not what they're going to do. Okay, as the fate of all Chinese people and as the unswerving historical mission of the Communist Party of China. Okay, I miss Wang Yi focused on analyzing the essence of the Taiwan issue, emphasizing that safeguarding national unity will always be the core of China's core interests. I say core, obviously not. Maybe they've got a common core thing going on there. It is the fate of all Chinese people is the unswerving historical mission of the Chinese Party of China. So China says, we're going to retake Taiwan. Stop, get out of the way. And what did Blinken say? Oh, well. Essentially, he said, oh, well. On this issue, China has no room for compromise. So we're going to take Taiwan. We're not compromising. U.S. side must truly adhere to the one China principle set out in the 3 Sino joint communiques, respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and clearly oppose Taiwan independence. So obviously, Blinken took this from this meeting and went back to Xi and said, yeah, we clearly oppose Taiwan independence, giving China a major policy victory with nothing in return. Zero in return. Zero in return. Blinken introduced the views of the United States, saying the U.S. is committed to returning to the agenda set by 2 heads of state in Bali and looks forward to strengthening communication with China, responsible management, control of differences, and cooperation areas of common interest. So this is how the Chinese this is how they wrote it up. So that is what we need to know. So let's see what didn't happen. Okay, here's the picture. This is the article that after the Xi meeting, and it's basically a bunch of gobbledygook. But Xi said it does not want this in China. Does not want to see conflict or confrontation or choose sides between the two countries. Expects the two countries coexist in peace, have friendly and cooperative relations. Remembering that that's based on an idea that China can take Taiwan and we don't do anything. Okay, all that said is saying, oh, we can have a peaceful relationship if you just let us take Taiwan. We have a peaceful relationship if you just allow us to flood the world with Chinese technology that will allow them to spy on every single thing and have operational control of every machine in the world. If you just let that happen, gee, we can get along. It's just insane. It's insane. I want to remind you guys that one thing that people forget is this is a meeting that was originally scheduled a few months ago, and then something happened which changed a few things. The Chinese decided that they were going to send a spy balloon across America, and it was a test to see whether or not we were going to respond to it or not, what our response would be. And as far as I can tell, based on these communiques that came out of it, Anthony Blinken didn't mention one time the fact that the Chinese sent a spy balloon across America, spying on our military facilities. Now, the Biden administration wanted us to believe that the spy balloon was just floating along and wasn't really operational and didn't actually, get any intelligence. It was just a benign, kind of almost like a stray weather balloon. And they shot down a couple of weather balloons afterwards just to show that they were serious. But they let a Chinese spy device hover over our military installations that are the most important military installations we have. And what did we do out of that? Well, guess what? This is from this is a briefing from the Pentagon, obviously. Chinese spy balloon gathered intelligence from U.S. military sites, officials say. So this is the Biden administration admitting, the Deputy Sabrina Singh, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary. And just first paragraph, Chinese spy balloon that flew across America, the U.S. was able to gather intelligence from several sensitive military sites, despite the Biden administration's effort to block it from doing so, according to 2 current senior U.S. officials and 1 former senior administration official. China was able to control the balloons. It could make multiple passes over some of the sites, at times flying figure eight formations, and transmit the information collected back to China in real time, the three officials said. The intelligence China collected was mostly from electronic signals, which could be picked up from weapon systems or include communications from base personnel rather than images. Okay. So, folks, you think that might come up? You think that might come up? Gee, you sent a spy balloon across our country and spied on us, and that's not a very friendly act. In fact, that's an act of war. But no, didn't come up. We delayed the meeting by 2 months. That was the big punishment. Did Chinese diplomats get sent home? No. Did any Chinese diplomats get called to the State Department for a talking to? No. Did the spy balloon get shot down, over Iowa, where it would have landed in a field and we could have collected the parts to it easily? No. Did we shoot down the spy balloon using essentially a low grade, let's say, shooting it with 50 caliber machine gun? So the balloon, basically failed. Or did we shoot it with a big missile that then that would have effectively blew up a lot of the component parts of the balloon? Oh, we shot it with a big missile. Where did we shoot it down at? We shot it down over the Atlantic Ocean after it completed its run. Did this come up? No, didn't come up. Defense Department said it did damage to us. Never came up. I'm just going to go back to a simple theory here. And it seems sometimes when you get 1 and 1, you have to come up with the answer of 2. And I don't, is it possible? And I think most people are asking this, and people around the world are asking this. We know that the Chinese government, the Chinese entities, have spent a lot of money buying into Hunter Biden stock. There is apparently reason that FBI's had reason to believe since at least January, or at least 2019, that Joe Biden has been a direct beneficiary of those Chinese investment in Hunter Biden, a direct beneficiary, money in his bank account. So we have reason to believe that the FBI has known this since 2019, did nothing about it. So now a question I always comes around, well, what did the Chinese get? What do these foreign actors get? What the Ukrainian, what did Burisma get in exchange for giving Hunter Biden and Joe Biden by inference, or at least by records that the FBI has a legitimate complaint, a legitimate concern, through a 20 corporation, shell corporation kind of money laundering operation that the money was sent through. So what did we actually give to the Chinese? What did we give to them? Well, could it be we're going to let your spy balloon fly across the country and get all sorts of military secrets and not going to do anything. And then we're going to blow it up in a way that we're going to try to hope that we blow it up so we don't actually get your component parts. We can't reconstruct what you did. And we're going to blow it up out in the ocean so it's hard, so heavy stuff sinks and we're not able to get a complete reconstruction. Is that one of the things that they got? I don't know. But reasonable people can ask those questions and should be. Reasonable people should be asking those questions because ultimately, Joe Biden getting a bunch of money is one thing. But when he becomes president and you start seeing actions like the Secretary of State going in front of Xi and mouthing the exact words that were written for him by the Chinese Secretary of State that I read to you earlier, effectively giving the Chinese a wink and a nod for Blinken. Blinken giving them a wink and a nod. I should have done it differently. That Taiwan, not so important to us. Is that a cost? Is that part of the payment, the repayment? We don't know. The fact we have to ask that question about our president of the United States is really, really the dangerous piece of this. But what's more dangerous even than that is the fact that apparently the rest of the world knew that Biden was for sale. It's a little bit off the China course, but think about it. Somehow a natural gas company in Ukraine knew they were for sale. Some Romanian oligarch knew they were for sale. The wife of the Moscow mayor knew they were for sale. The Chinese knew they were for sale. Apparently, everybody in the world knew they were for sale except for the people of the United States when they reelected him president. The FBI knew he was for sale. They had this stuff in 2019. They ran a whole undercover operation to try to suppress knowledge about the Hunter Biden laptop in 2020. So our own FBI knew they were for sale. Well, guess what? When somebody has been for sale and they've taken money, it isn't the fact they took the money. It's the fact that they're afraid that will come out, that gives leverage by a foreign power like China to use against that entity. So was Joe Biden influenced? Were the decisions made by Joe Biden, the commander-in-chief, related to how to deal with the spy balloon? Hard to believe it wasn't brought directly to his desk because it was an act of war. The Chinese spy balloon was an act of war. It was an audacious act of war, a slow-moving balloon that was doing figure eights over our NORAD facilities. Think about that. Our intercontinental defense, missile defense system was compromised by a slow-moving balloon that we chose not to shoot down, that we apparently tracked from its launch point. Took 5 days to alert the president that it existed. Nobody would alert the president it even existed until some farmer, some rancher in Montana looked up and said, "Hey, there's a strange balloon overhead. It looks like a UFO." And suddenly people paid attention. I mean, we have a problem, folks. I don't know if Joe Biden is compromised, but it sure appears that he is. Just another reason why he has to be impeached. He has to be impeached. The fact that the rest of the world can't depend that he's going to act in U.S. interests rather than his own personal interests to protect not to protect the allies in the United States, but rather to has other sub rosa reasons that are based on his own personal greed and avarice. That makes the world a much more dangerous place and puts us in a position where we're much more likely to end up being in nuclear exchanges. I mean, that's a dangerous situation. Kamala Harris is no better. The people who would work for her are the same people. We'd have the same exact policies. But at the very least, you would get out from under the pall of the corruption. Most people don't realize that Kamala Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff, as an attorney, was lead attorney and partner of a major international law firm that primarily did deals with China and worked with the Chinese government as go-betweens for the Chinese government and multinationals attempting to get business in China. So Harris is as connected in a bad way as Biden. But you don't have to question, you don't have to say, gee whiz, we don't know if the money that they took is coloring decisions. So anyhow, let's go to the rest of this thing. Did spy balloons. Okay, so here's one of the headlines. I didn't want to pay the New York Times, so I'm just taking the headline. U.S. worries about private Chinese companies aiding Russia. So this is a story that came out today also in the New York Times. And you have my personal, and it's a story that is, very straightforward. This was put out as part of the Blinken trip to China. From the State Department. And so here, let's just be absolutely upfront how absurd this is. Xi met with Putin. He declared fealty with Putin. The relations with Putin have become stronger than ever between China and Russia. And we're going to China, who's declared war on us and who effectively has been working with Putin all along and egging him on. We're saying, oh, we're worried that Chinese companies are aiding Russia in Ukraine. If you came to the Chinese with that, they would look at you like you were nuts and say, aren't you funding the Ukrainians? Aren't you sending your military equipment to Ukraine? What are you talking about? Russia is an ally of China. Why, you give them happy talk language and say, oh yeah, we'll check into that. But anybody in their right mind who believes this New York Times thing, the U.S. worries about private Chinese companies aiding Russia, of course they're aiding Russia. Duh. What do you think's going to happen? There's nothing more in China's interest than degrading the supply of the U.S. munitions that we can use in the Pacific region by allowing the Ukrainians to fire them off at Russian tanks. That's in their interest. It's absurd. Of course, China had their solution that they offered to Ukraine and Russia, and said, well, if you just, our solution is Ukraine should just give up the territory they lost and ask for a ceasefire. And that was the Chinese solution. Putin didn't accept it. Zelensky didn't accept it. But they basically repeated what Putin had said and said, okay, that's our peace solution. You know what Zelensky has done in the interim? He's offered to China access to Ukrainian markets. He said, we're going to allow China to come in and do stuff in Ukraine. So we're giving you hundreds of billions of dollars to Zelensky. And he's reaching out to China and saying, hey, look at what we could do for you. This reminds me a lot of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, where we spent 20 years of blood and treasure, lots of blood. What the Afghan government, while we were there, what did the Afghan government do? And by the way, this was when Trump was president. They said to China, hey, China, you want to develop our rare earth minerals? Yeah, we got these rare earth minerals over here and they're near the border of China. You want to do the development on that? So while our troops were there in China, while we are there in Afghanistan, the Afghan government made a deal with China to develop the rare earth minerals. It's a very similar deal. And it's time that Americans say, no more. We're not doing this. We're not sending our money, and in the case of Afghanistan, our troops, to defend interests and then not have reciprocity where there's a promise of a better U.S. alliance, an economic alliance in the future. That's stupid. Why would we do that? Why would we keep the world safe for Chinese economic advantage? That's insane. And yet that's been what's happened over the last 15 years anyway. So time to rethink China. Time to rethink China in a very direct way. China's told us that we can have peace if we just surrender and surrender the historical dialectic and understand that China's going to be the dominant power in the 21st century. We've had our time. It's time for us to get off the stage. If we're willing to do that, yeah, China sits there and says, we might let you have a few crumbs, but trust me, there won't be very many crumbs because China destroys their enemies. They crush their enemies. There's no compassion. There's no gee whiz, you get to come in second. In this fight, coming in second means you die. Means America dies. That's what it means. It means freedom dies. And it might die with a ostensibly American president imposing a Chinese social credit score system on Americans and destroying any semblance of the Declaration of Independence or the DNA of the United States. But that's the death, because China, it's in their interest not to have to fire a shot. Let us surrender by becoming them. Let us surrender by becoming them. Eliminate the DNA of the United States in the Declaration of Independence. eliminate the law of the United States embodied by the Constitution, and create a vassal state that does the Chinese will. And it helps the Chinese enforce Chinese rule around the world. Gee, what a concept. Folks, when you read about China, just understand the Chinese government is the Communist Party of China. When multinationals go to China, they do have a simple thing they have to do. They have to essentially become part of the team over there. You know, people worry about there's been concerns. One of the things that was stated by the Secretary of State and U.S. Secretary of State was concerns about U.S. companies not being allowed to leave China. Big surprise. You get intertangled and interwoven with the communist government, and they don't let you leave. They don't let you pick up your toys and go. No, they don't. So companies like General Motors, which invested heavily after they were bailed out in the United States, they took the balance sheet that had zero debt on it. They beefed up they borrowed a bunch of money, and they invested heavily in factories in China. That's what happened. Flint, Michigan, they didn't go in Flint, Michigan and rebuild that plant. Nope. They went and invested in China. That's what GM did. You look at even Tesla. Elon Musk is dependent upon China for batteries. Just true. So you're looking at a world where we're being driven into a world where we're going to have Chinese-made batteries, Chinese-made windmills, and the domestic energy supply dependent upon those things. And China's just going to say, no, you don't get them. Supply chain problems. You heard of those. And what's the result? An America that becomes crippled by our own insanity of having become reliant on Chinese-made products to fuel our economy. They're fighting a war. It's a multi-front war against the U.S. It's time we wake up to it and say no. It's time we wake up to the left and say, no, we will not do what you want, even if it's well-intentioned, because it benefits those who would destroy us. And let's hope America can come around and understand that we are the beacon of freedom for the world and we're worth fighting for. And it's time that we stand up and say no to the people in Congress who want to cave to the Chinese at every turn and cave to their interests at every turn, both Republican and Democrat, and to an administration that is essentially surrendering every chance they get. Rick Manning, Americans for Limited Government. I'm going to take a look at some comments here. Sorry for getting so far. Let's see. I'm going to pull this thing over so I can see them. And just go wild. Okay. So I'm going to start from the bottom. You're absolutely correct in that assessment. And our military is not capable of protecting us because they're concerned about abortions and pronouns. Well, Gene, yeah, but remember, our Secretary of Navy about a month ago said, when asked what's the number one problem facing the U.S. Navy, he said climate change. So apparently our Navy is concerned that their ports of call will be, that the ocean heights will be an inch higher at some point in the next century. And that's the number one concern of our U.S. Navy. It's not the rising threat of the Chinese Navy. It's not the fact that they're doing hypersonic missiles that we may not be able to defend our ships from. It's not that. No, the problem is the biggest problem facing the Navy is climate change. So yeah, and oh, by the way, they're using fuels, renewables in a lot of the ships. So some algae-based stuff, which guess what you can't get? You can't get those at other ports of call. So the minute you move away from standard oil and diesel running your ships or nuclear running your ships, you're dependent upon new technology, fuels to run your ships. The idea is they aren't available anywhere. That's a problem if you're in the Navy. This is the same Biden administration that wants our Army, all of our tanks and all of our trucks and all of our Jeeps and the like to all be electric all over around the world. It's insane. How do you project power if you can only go as far as an extension cord will let you? But of course, this is the same president who announced that wants to build a train to Asia. So going over the Pacific Ocean, the deepest ocean in the world, wants to run a train. It runs 500 miles per hour over the ocean for 8,000 miles. So who knows? We live in a world where our administration is completely disconnected from reality, and it is crazy. Mike Olson, Trump even has grandchild learning Chinese, succumbing to them. No, I think that's called learning, trying to learn more about them and being able to read in their own language. If, bottom line is, if you're going to choose a language for your kids to learn in, you have to understand we're at a bipolar world now where there are two powers in the world. There's and in this binary two-power world, you darn well better have people who are on our side being able to read their language. So I'm not going to say that's submission, unless you want to say that when you were taught Chinese in school, or you taught Spanish in school, that was a submission to Mexico. It might feel that way now, but nonetheless. Let's see here. We have internationalists who represent the USA. They are no loyal. Mike, you're right, but the fact is, internationalists are in the State Department. That's what they do. The Trump administration was attempting to deal with that, and a lot of those areas, and that's why Mike Flynn had to go. He wasn't allowed to be. He couldn't be allowed to keep his job, and so he was undercut immediately by somebody who's running for president right now, and that person was in the Trump administration, but is not the former president. And so, take that for what it's worth. But the fact of the matter is, there was a plan the internationalists, the globalists in our government, spent 4 years undermining President Trump. And all you need to do is go look at the Ukraine impeachment and see the list of people who were up talking, and you'll see the faces of those globalists. By the way, we're not even mentioning the fact that Anthony Blinken never, when he was in China, when he was talking to Xi, never did mention that nasty little COVID virus they unleashed on the world, because he didn't want to bring up the inconvenient fact that Anthony Fauci was involved in exporting some of the technology to do just that, and certainly giving them money to do just that. So it's no. Blinken couldn't mention the fact that the COVID origins in Wuhan, and the Biden administration is desperately looking for somebody to come up with a study saying that it could possibly be wet labs, because it's the only way they get out of culpability for the virus. By they, I mean those who have been aiding and abetting China and Chinese development of biological weapons, which is what they do at the Wuhan Institute. Biden's endless military supplies to Ukraine has depleted the U.S. military arsenal, so China knows it could attack Taiwan, as the U.S. will be unable to supply Taiwan with the needed munitions. More importantly, yes, Richard, you're right. And but one of the problems is if China is able to surround Taiwan with their navy by pushing their whole navy around Taiwan, and we're basically trying to deal with the 1 or 2 aircraft carriers and what we can project across 1,000 miles with the ocean versus next door, it's really going to be hard to supply Taiwan, except for through airlifts and the like. The key is to be able to supply Taiwan early, so have them stockpile now, and those munitions that could have been sold to Taiwan now are not being able to be sold because we're sending them to Ukraine. In my estimation, one of the great military diversions in history. And for those who, I'm just going to leave it at that. I don't want to get into Ukraine. COVID was a biological attack, just as balloon is. Yeah, COVID was a biological attack. It was biological. I think it's a lot of people believe that it's a biological weapon. I don't know that. I can't say that for certain. But it certainly is dangerous not to have gone to China and said, you've closed all the doors to get to the bottom of this. It's in the international community's interest to get to the bottom of it, so it never happens again. Nope, doesn't get mentioned. Let's see here. Palestinian Authority establishes a strategic partnership with China. Yep. Guess what? Ironically, Netanyahu's also reached out to China. Why? Saudi Arabia's reached out to China. America has lost our soft power, and that soft power was being able to go to somebody and say, we really would prefer you not do that, and have them not do it. And the reason that we've lost our soft power is because we have lost the believability that we will act, that our soft power means anything. We've lost the believability that we'll stand by our allies. And that's not helped when we go off to when we tell China that, oh, well, Taiwan's expendable, essentially. That's not, let's face it, that doesn't increase the feeling, the warm and fuzzies of people around the world who depend on the United States as an ally against China. So, of course, they're reaching out to China. Because ultimately, unlike America, the Saudis and others view, and the Palestinian Authority, certainly the Israelis, they view their own survival as the number one thing their government's supposed to do, survival of their own country. And the U.S. is perhaps the only country in the history of the world that doesn't view its own survival as being important. Because if we did, we'd shut our borders. If we did, we'd act a lot different. And Donald Trump brought that up more than once, continues to bring that up, and he's vilified, and they're trying to jail him. It's just upside down world. Why did all the billionaires go over there? Something big is about to happen. Mike, I don't know about the billionaires going over there. I tend to avoid making predictions about, timing on stuff. I just know that if I were the Chinese, I wouldn't bother. I wouldn't bother doing anything from a military perspective. And the reason is they don't have to. The reason they talked about historical imperative and the like is because they're saying we're going to win anyway. You might as well just go along for the ride, make it comfortable for yourself, because you're not going to win. And that's not a win based on violence. That's a win based on the fact that we're surrendering across the globe and we're giving them power over us to blackmail us into submission, as I described with Huawei and other things and the green energy push. That's a pathway to submission, because once people get really cold in the winter because there's no way to heat the homes, they can't feed their families because we've gotten rid of the gas stoves, and the ability to use propane as a separate energy source off the grid. I mean, we've done those kind of things. A hungry populace is a populace that will surrender if the hunger can be lifted out of desperation. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it takes over when people are hungry and somebody says, I can feed you. People who are hungry say, well, how? They say, well, you just have to do this. You just have to effectively surrender to China and say, well, let's surrender. I'm hungry. That's what happens. That's taking things down to their most basic needs. Patriotic needs are much higher on the hierarchy of needs. And hence, if you can break down individuals into being hungry or into being at war with one another, you have a different sense of what's true and what's worth fighting for. Are you going to fight for your family to be able to eat before you're going to fight for a government to survive? Well, you know what? Most people will fight for the family to be able to eat. So it's a little bit not disconcerting. It's just the reality. And that's why we have to fight on a bunch of fronts: the Huawei front, the New Green Deal front. We have to fight on 100 fronts, as opposed to this kind of almost, I would call it naive, except for the people are very smart. And they're doing everything they can, who are doing this are very smart. They're doing everything they can to promote Chinese interests, at least I'll say Chinese interests. And as a result, it's we have to call it what it is. And I just don't think we can. We just have to win battles where we can now, and make certain that that we end up with regime change in America in 2024, 2025. Let's see here. News photographer took pics. The second balloon in Venezuela, pics were clear, while media and everyone else pretended they didn't know what they looked like. Yeah, they had balloons flying all over the place, and it was timed directly with the Blinken visit, and it was meant to embarrass us, and they succeeded. They showed that we were unwilling to stand up and even defend our airspace. Seems like Biden's been blackmailed by China his entire career for something. I don't know that he's been blackmailed by China his entire career. I think Biden has, the former Secretary of Defense of the Obama administration, said that that Biden had been wrong, 40 years of being wrong on foreign policy. So I don't know that he has to be necessarily. I think he could claim that historically he's been wrong, and so there's nothing different if he's just not very good at it. But I think we have to ask. I think it's fair to ask the question. Still unsure how they stole our satellite technology. Yeah, well, I don't think that was a Clinton problem. And if you go back and you look at a guy named James Riotti, who was, I think, Indonesian, was passing a lot of money to the Clintons, and a lot of U.S. technology left the Los Alamos, stealth technology and the like, left the Los Alamos lab. And, people said, well, we had a generational advantage over anybody in the world because of the R&D, the primary R&D we did, and what we were developing out of it. And then China basically stole it. Now I'll let you look up Riyadi for yourself, and you can, I'll contemplate on that. Maybe we'll talk about it sometime. I know that a guy named Chris Cox, who was a U.S. congressman, was in the midst of investigating that. And there was a lot of stories. And then suddenly a story about a girl with a beret came up, and it pushed everything off the news. And the real problem in the Clinton administration, which was the leaking of our top secret information to people who don't like us very much, and what appeared to be a connection between the Clinton administration and some money flows that were going on. It never got fully proven, so you have to just have to read and see where it was going. But it was a very real investigation. It was a very dangerous investigation, in that it pointed to some things that were just not survivable, and real treason. And so I'll let you read up on it yourself, and you can draw your own conclusions. Let's see. Drugs are bad. You must be living under a damn rock. Stop drinking the Kool-Aid. I don't know who you're talking to, but I didn't think I said drugs are good. I'm not going to, Michael, that's funny. I'm going to read this just because. Notice the only thing open was number one, Chinese food, when everything else was shut down or forced to shut down during COVID. I didn't notice that, but it's no, Walmart was open. I know Walmart was open to sell Chinese stuff. I know that Amazon was able to get packages delivered. I know that big grocery stores like Kroger and others were allowed to stay open. I know that, but the people who couldn't stay open was anybody who was an entrepreneur, anybody who was on Main Street, anybody who didn't have multinational, international connections, and that's to our eternal shame. And that was let's just be clear, that happened during the Trump administration. If you gave Donald Trump a do-over, that would be a place where he might sit there and say, in retrospect, we made a bad mistake in doing that. Let's see. Let's see. They did when construction or missile silos are being done. They went all over those with the balloon. Yep, that's exactly right, Mike. They did a full recon, real-time recon, when there was a scramble situation, when there was a foreign invader over our space, and they did a full recon of how people, what the communications were and the like. And so they now know what we do to respond. The single unknowable until now for the Chinese was, how do we respond? What's our response time? How long does it take for us to do stuff? Do we do stuff? Does the system work? Well, they know what the communications were. They know what people were saying in real time, because that's what they were listening to. They were listening to real communications. They weren't just taking photos, which they were doing before. They were listening to the communications on the ground. And they learned a lot about how our system works and our rapid response system, and that puts America in danger. Mexico is China's middleman now. They value U.S. citizens' lives very little. Well, they do value U.S. citizens' lives very little, but I'm going to say Mexico has a problem in that the cartels are the most powerful thing in China and Mexico. The Sinaloa cartel controls the major western port in Mexico. They run that port. The Mexican government doesn't. And so in some ways, the Mexican government itself is somewhat irrelevant, because the Chinese have carved out their own relationship with the cartels. And it's the cartel relationship which controls the border between Mexico and the United States, and on both sides of the border. So you get right down to it. And given that we have given up any semblance of having a border, you can't blame Mexico for that. Mexico, when Donald Trump was there, agreed to a remain in Mexico policy, it was enforced because Mexico had a problem. They don't want all their people bleeding out of Mexico either. So Mexico had a problem. It allowed them to stem the flow of immigration through their country, which had a tremendous cost to Mexico. So when they had a strong U.S. government, Mexico was an ally. When you have a weak U.S. government, Mexico's can be an ally of whoever they have to be an ally with to survive. I don't blame the Mexicans. I blame the U.S. government. Let's see here. A rep at Microsoft went to China to train them. They told them to shut and sit down. Kind of funny, he looked like Dr. Phil, bug eyes. They had printed knowledge base articles. Okay, I don't know what that means, but I guess it means that they knew what they had stolen everything they needed to steal. One of the interesting things, and I'll just end with this because it's a little story. About 10, 15 years ago, I was talking to a member of the press who I knew pretty well, and they had done a trip to China, and as part of a foreign delegation that went to China. And this was back when I was head of public affairs at the Labor Department, and Labor Secretary went along with some other PR people. I did not go. I was left behind to kind of deal with all the problems that came up in America. At least from a public relations standpoint, but it was this trip to China that they went on, and some of the reporters said, "Hey, we'd like to not get off of the approved route and go to some of the markets?" And so they wandered off and they went into some of the markets, and they were shocked to see in the original packaging that looked just like Microsoft Office, the latest version of Microsoft Office, available for sale on the street, on the basically flea markets of China. What made it so amazing was that version of Microsoft Office hadn't been released in the United States or anywhere in the world yet. It had been knocked off by the Chinese before Gates could even get to market. So yeah, your Microsoft representative, they probably knew more about the Microsoft software than the Microsoft representative, because they stole it well before you guys could get it to market. At least that's what a reporter told me, and I tend to believe them. So with that, I'm going to let you all go. I appreciate you listening, and we will have another visit tomorrow on some other important topic. Take care, and we will see you tomorrow. And thank you for hanging in there with us. If you like us, please share this, share it. It's very important, and give and comment if you want to. we want this to get to as many people as possible. So the best way to get the algorithm to work is to share, like, and give a lot of interaction, because that's how the world, the algorithmic world works, both on YouTube and on Facebook and on Rumble. So let's get it out to as many people as possible. If you think it's valuable, we appreciate it, and we will talk to you tomorrow.